Thank you very much, Dr. Jamali. I'll not take much time because we are late already. I just want to say that we are so honored to have Dr. Saidi with us. Dr. Saidi comes with a very long and impressive CV, whether in the public service or in the regulatory bodies or in the private sector. And we were just chatting. He has a close attachment to Lebanon and to AUB. And I'm so glad that we have him. The topic is extremely important, so I will not hold him further. Dr. Saidi, the floor is yours.
So I'll welcome everybody, and I'm not sure that I need to introduce Dr. Saidi. So I think, as we say in Arabic, and I'll say it in Arabic, غني عن التعريف. He has an illustrious career as an economist in the public sector, a first vice governor twice of the central bank, a former minister, president of Saidi Associates. I mean, just an illustrious career as an economist. When we read his work and we hear his commentary on Lebanon, we're always more informed than before reading it and before hearing it. So it's an absolute delight to have you with us today. We have 65 participants looking forward to listen to your insights. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dean Sidani, Dr. Jamali, for inviting me. AUB, of course, is my alma mater, both in terms of IC as well as AUB, so very close to my heart, and I continue to be in contact. So there'll be quite a bit of content that I will go through. Don't worry, this is being recorded and I'll make the presentation available. As you can see from the title, it ends with a question mark. Either we have a failed state, which is our current state, or we reform and we transform Lebanon. So on the agenda, really three parts. We'll review the current macro, fiscal, financial, and socioeconomic developments. Much of that, of course, is familiar to you, but we'll be doing it from my own lens, from my point of view. Then, of course, look at why is it that we got here? Why is it that we have a failed state? And what should we do about it? So those are the reforms and transformation. But first, let's see where we are. We are now into the fourth year of decline of real GDP. The total decline since 2018 is something like 42%. This is one of the most severe in the world. I think the only country which has gone through a worse time is Chile in 1926, but that was associated with a massive decline in the copper price, which was Chile's main export, as well as political problems in Chile. In terms of Lebanon, this decline in GDP is associated with four main pillars of our economy being destroyed. Those are trade and tourism, the health sector, the education sector, banking and finance. And of course, that's associated with massive bankruptcies across all activities, and not just lucrative activities. It's also the non-lucrative NGOs and other. Unemployment is north of 40%. And you know the numbers on poverty, massive increase in poverty to 77% of the population. 45% is living food poverty, i.e. living on less than $2 per day. And of course, as a result of all this, we've had massive migration. We don't know the exact numbers, but anything between 300 to 400,000. The reason why this is critical is that if this continues, it's likely to become permanent, and it'd be very difficult for Lebanon to rebuild. So you have what we call long-term scarring of the economy. On the financial side, of course, the pound has lost more than 90% of its value in less than 2 years, so massive depreciation. Inflation is running at around 150% this year. And the important thing from an economic point of view, of course, is that inflation and exchange rate depreciation act as a tax on income. It's an inflation tax, but also acts as a wealth tax. So much of the wealth, the financial wealth of Lebanon and the Lebanese and several generations of Lebanese has been destroyed. We're living a haircut of some 85% of GDP. Now, if you think of how it is that we started getting here, you have to go back. I'm not going to go back in history. We'll talk a little bit about that a bit later. But I'm talking about now is what is it that triggered this collapse, which many of us had been expecting, but we didn't expect it to happen as quickly and as severely. So the trigger to that is the bank closures of October 2019. The Association of Banks, with the approval of the central bank, shut down the banks for some 15 days. This, of course, whenever you shut down the banks, and this was unprecedented, we had never shut down the banks, even during the Civil War or on any other occasion, during Israeli invasions, etc. This was a massive jolt to confidence and provoked a panic and a run on the banks. So the trigger to the financial collapse that we're living started there. And of course, once you had the run on the banks, then the reaction to that was to stop payments and impose informal capital controls to try and control the situation. And then as a result of that, you got a massive liquidity and credit crunch and the beginning of the financial meltdown as people started to de-risk away from the banking system and of the Lebanese pound. As a result of that, you had a collapse of domestic and international trade. You couldn't trade internationally, you couldn't open letters of credit, you couldn't import. And the combination of all that led to, on the one hand, an aggregate demand shock, big decline in investment, big decline in consumption, but also an aggregate supply shock because you didn't have the inputs. And so all of this, of course, translates into a shock, a sharp drop in real GDP and a sharp wealth shock, a large decline in wealth. On the right-hand side, we look at the inflation spiral. The exchange rate depreciation leads to an inflation and spiral and inflation expectations, which then lead to lower real wealth because of the decline in inflation. The lower real wealth has a further impact on aggregate demand and leads to additional exchange rate depreciation and inflation. So inflationary spiral develops between the exchange rate and the inflation. And of course, you remember that more than 80% of our goods that we consume are imported. Now, we have a new government in place after 11 months of caretaking government, if you can call it caretaking. The new Miati government has several things on its agenda. The main one on its agenda is elections, short-term stabilization of the economy, trying to assist in terms of ration cards to combat poverty, massive poverty, humanitarian aid, trying to obtain humanitarian aid, and of course, restarting the IMF elections. So those are the main things on the agenda. This is limited in time, of course, because it has a limited lifetime. We now know that it ends by March 2022. Now, the table in front of you has got the main macro and financial indicators, and there are, as you'll see on the right-hand side for 2022, two scenarios. One in which there is reform, and one in which is 222A, and the other one 222B without reforms. So if I just look at the 2021, notice the large decline in real GDP, which we mentioned. Here, expected decline is 8%. I think it's likely to be even higher than 8%. I think probably 10 to 12%. GDP deflator, of course, indicates inflation, and the inflation rate expected probably by the end of the year, end of period, will be about 204%. Decline in the exchange rate. Notice that there is an improvement in the current account balance, mainly because, of course, you contracted imports very substantially, and you might have increased exports a little bit, but we can come back to that. Reserves, a massive decline in reserves. of the central bank, an improvement in the fiscal balance. The reason why you have the improvement in the fiscal balance is because there are no longer interest payments. So much of it has to do with the interest cost of the debt. And of course, in real terms, government expenditures have declined, and so have government revenues. So why did we get here? So here we go back as to the underlying reasons for all this. Of course, at the root of this meltdown are what we call the two twin deficits: unsustainable fiscal and unsustainable current account deficit. Government for more than 20 years, 25 years has been running unsustainable fiscal deficits, unsustainable fiscal policy. But importantly, the value of the pound, which was pegged, became increasingly overvalued. And as a result of that, as a result of the large budget deficits and the overvalued Lebanese pound, you generated a current account, increasing current account deficit, and now a debt, banking, and currency crisis. And fundamentally, and this is the important part, the BDL, central bank, ran a Ponzi scheme, which effectively has generated the biggest financial collapse in history. Now, how did that come about? Well, to protect the pound, high interest rates were paid to attract deposits into the banking system and then into the central bank. And then the central bank continued borrowing and undertook what they called financial engineering, which was namely a bailout of the banking sector in 2015 and continuing up to 2019, 2020. But of course, the high interest rates compounded the fiscal deficit. So it became more and more expensive for government to borrow, and it led to debt growth. And eventually, that bubble, that Ponzi scheme, blew up, which is what we're living. But as a result of this, you've got three interlinked balance sheets: the balance sheet of the government, the balance sheet of the commercial banks, and the balance sheet of the central bank. So those are intimately connected, and this makes Lebanon's financial collapse and financial crisis virtually unique. We haven't had that practically anywhere in the world. And the reason why you had that is because the banks were allowed to put something like 75% of their assets in government and central bank debt. This is unprecedented and goes against all the regulatory requirements and macroprudential requirements of Basel on concentration of risk to any particular borrower. And BDL and the banks continue to refuse recognizing the losses on their balance sheet. So if you look at the roots, you got high public debt levels and budget deficits, large current account deficits. The banking system, as a result of the crisis, is now functionally bankrupt and increasingly illiquid. It's becoming, in effect, a zombie banking system. The real economy, by and large, did not grow since 2011 for a whole decade. So gradually, Lebanon was becoming poorer and poorer. And of course, underlying all of this is the fact that you have a politically fragmented system, politically rudderless, along with corruption and the rest. So we'll come back to that. Now, importantly, I think it's important to understand that the multiple crises, currency, debt, banking, and financial crisis, were not due to natural causes, were not due to war or to external intervention. So therefore, the crises were avoidable. This is important. We could have avoided everything that happened in Lebanon. The Jab government had prepared a plan with Lazar, negotiations that started with the IMF. And had that plan been implemented, we could have moved ahead with an agreement with the IMF. We could have had help from the international community and countries which are friendly to Lebanon. But in fact, these reforms that were part of the package were deliberately sabotaged by the politicians, by the banks, and the BDL, each for different reasons, but they combined together, they allied together to subvert the reform plan. Because the politicians, on the one hand, didn't want to undertake reforms, the banks didn't want to recognize the losses, which would have meant that they would have had to recapitalize and restructure the banking system. The BDL, of course, is the main responsible. They're responsible basically for the biggest transfer of wealth in the history of Lebanon in favor of the rich because of the high interest rate schemes that it put in place, and created really the biggest Ponzi scheme in history, greater than Madoff and greater than Ponzi himself. So what is happening now, basically, is that there's a deliberate policy of adjustment. So instead of reforms, you're having an adjustment to the macroeconomic gaps that we mentioned, current account, internal gaps, through deflation, real deflation, through immiserizing people so that you have lower income, then you spend less on imports. You try to get an adjustment to the current account and the trade account accordingly through that. Bottom line is that this is a deliberate policy. This is a deliberate haircut, and by far the biggest in financial history, bigger than anything that we've seen. So in this table, I think many of you have seen that. The World Bank has mentioned this. This comes from Reinhardt and Carmen Reinhardt and Rogoff, a study they did, which covered practically all financial crises from 1857 onwards. That's the list over there. Now, what you have there, of course, is the crisis severity includes both the number of years it took you to recover and how much of a decline in GDP and how long was the contraction. So we don't know yet what the final contraction will be in Lebanon and and how long the recovery will be. But if you just look at those numbers, on average, you're talking about a recovery from peak to recovery in nearly all cases of 20 years or so on average. So unless you do something very quickly, this is the outlook for our country. Unprecedented. So right now we are number 2 next to Chile, or very close to Spain. Spain was a case of civil war with the Franco regime. So we are right after Chile. And of course, we have to remember what's behind those numbers at the end of the day. Behind those numbers is poverty, unprecedented poverty. Lebanon, in the short space of 2 years, has been reduced from an upper middle income country to a third world country, very rapidly. So these are shocking numbers that you have in that chart. This shows what we call multi-dimensional poverty. So not just income poverty, and I'll explain what goes into the multi-dimension. So you'll see that if you look at particular governorates, you look at Akkar, okay, about more than 51% are in extreme poverty. If you look at, on the right-hand side, 92% are in extreme poverty, multi-dimensional poverty. For Lebanon as a whole, 82% of the population is now what we call multidimensional poor. Only 18% are on these grounds not poor. But of course, in the meantime, much of the middle class and the professional class has been destroyed. This is really what should be on our minds and how we address that. So if you look at what we mean by multidimensional poverty, it's not just income or employment, which is on the right-hand side. The main contributor in particular is health. We've seen a rapid deterioration in the health system. People don't have access to medicines. People don't have access to health care. So the whole health system is breaking down, even in the best of cases, such as AUB or other universities, hospitals. Public utilities, of course, and their services, electricity, water, are all contributors, as well as education. So increasingly, our population has been reduced to a very, very poor population. And I'm sure you've seen those pictures. You can multiply those pictures. Never in my life would I have imagined or thought that our country would be reduced to this. These are the images that should stick in your mind. These are the images that should make us want to make the people who led us here accountable for what they've done. This is critical. If there's no accountability for what was a deliberate act and of policy adjustment, then we will never recover. So keep those images in mind. But let's move on. I want to spend a little bit of time, obviously, talking about reforms and what we should be doing about that. We're now, of course, living a case of multiple exchange rates. The bottom chart, of course, gives you a picture that most of us know extremely well, the rapid depreciation of the exchange rate. And notice that it accelerated, right? And now we're running at a 90% depreciation of the exchange rate, if not more, and continued depreciation. The top charts, the top panels, show you on the right-hand side one of the main reasons. Rapid growth of M0 and money supply. You'll see that curve rapidly increasing, and of course, at the same time, a rapid decline in the central bank's reserves. Not because it was defending the pound, but because it was subsidizing imports of so-called essentials, foodstuffs, and other. As it turned out, in fact, much of those subsidies did not go to the poor. We estimate that less than 20% of the subsidies actually went to the poor in Lebanon. The rest of the benefit mainly went into Syria, such as for diesel, oil, gas, etc., and to the traders and the rich. On the left-hand side is the picture in terms of inflation. Now notice that food inflation has accelerated at an even faster pace than the overall inflation rate. There are good reasons for that. In particular, remember that when you're poor, you tend to spend a higher proportion of your income on food and related, and that has tended to increase food prices. And much of our food, of course, is directly imported. The lower blue line in terms of inflation is lower, particularly because housing, we have rent controls. So housing, transport, and a couple of other basic goods and services have not had similar increases in inflation. Eventually, there will be a catch-up. Despite the crises, neither the Job government nor so far, or the Hariri government before that, or the Miati government so far, none of them have undertaken fiscal reforms. And at the same time, revenue has been declining. If you take customs, for example, there is the so-called customs exchange rate. The customs exchange rate is still at 1505. So in other words, if you're importing goods, the value of the customs duty is calculated at the 1505 exchange rate. So in effect, you're continuing to subsidize imports, right? Because the actual value of customs that you're paying is trivial compared to the true value or the market value of that. And of course, income has declined, VAT revenues have declined, so a large decline in revenues. And as a result of all this, deficits continue to be high. And if you look at that table comes from the World Bank. It's true that you'll see a decline in the overall deficit, and you now have a decline in the primary deficit. But all of this really comes because of the large decline in interest payments. Remember that you've stopped paying debt, you've got to stop paying interest on foreign debt and foreign currency debt, and stop paying interest on the domestic debt. So no adjustment, no reforms, no attempts really to correct the large fiscal gap. As a result of this, of course, government has been increasingly financed by the central bank. So the monetary financing of the fiscal deficits is continuing and is leading to higher inflation. So that's a major source of inflation. In terms of the other deficit, in terms of the external deficit, the large depreciation of the Lebanese pound and the de facto capital account controls have both led to a sharp contraction in imports. But also, one of the things that's happened is that it has led to a sudden stop in capital inflows. We know from nearly all experiences that, all financial crisis experiences, that when investors see that the system is no longer sustainable, you have a sudden stop in capital. And that's what Lebanon experienced during 2019 and potentially maybe a bit earlier. So the lack of capital inflows, of course, has made adjustment even more difficult. Now, interestingly, notice on the right-hand side that Lebanon continues to attract remittances. Currently, of course, because of the decline in income, it's the largest percentage. So more than 30% of GDP now is accounted for by remittances. And so you've an estimated 6.2, 6.5 billion still comes in as remittances. But here, and this is important, it no longer comes through the banking system. Yeah, the loss of confidence in the banking system, the loss of confidence in deposits and holding amounts in deposit has meant that it's coming in through cash, through money changers, and the like. So what you're having, of course, is a process of disintermediation from the banking system, and increasingly a cash economy. And until you restore trust in the banking system, that those inflows, remittances and other, will not come in through the banking system, and therefore will not be able to feed the credit cycle or the payment cycle. So what you need is really a banking sector reform in order to restore those flows, which can be substantial. So part of this is the bottom line. The bottom line is that if you look at our multiple crises, economic and financial, all of those crises, banking and the rest, are really the result of incompetence. Take the example of subsidies. The subsidies that were put in place by the Ministry of Economy and Trade included, I think, something like 315 products. They included things like caviar, salmon. They included cranberry juice. It's difficult to imagine that the poor are going to be consuming caviar, cranberry juice, and salmon. And yet they persisted with that failed subsidy program, which really meant helping the rich, the traders, and Syria next door. We know those. Everything, as I mentioned, only 20% actually went to the poor in Lebanon. So that's an example really of incompetence and the failed policy. You can multiply those examples. And of course, you've got endemic corruption, you've got the malgovernance, you've got the dysfunctional politics. All of those have turned Lebanon from not just being a fragile state or failing state, but actually into a failed state. What do we mean by a failed state? There are several definitions. I put in one of them there. But fundamentally, it's a case in which a government fails at its basic responsibilities. And just as on the bottom right-hand side, if you look at the crises that we're living, out of all crises, something like 44% of all crises were currency crises, 29% were banking crises, 5% debt, only 2% of crises globally, over historically, have combined that. We've done that. We are in that 2%. So now if you look at the Fragile States Index, we are certainly part of that Fragile State Index and continuing to live there. So where do we go from here? There are two paths ahead. One path indicates that we would continue downwards into further deterioration, into hell. The other one is potentially some sort of salvation and a rescue for Lebanon. So what sort of reforms are we talking about? Here's a list. You can multiply those. Those are my favorite list. Again, these are from the point of view of an economist. I could have drawn up a similar list from a political economy point of view, but I want to focus here on the economic aspects. On the left-hand side are the types of reforms that you want to put in place, covering monetary policy, fiscal. You have to have unified exchange rate. Anything else will mean a continuation of the current multiple exchange rate system, which invites even more corruption and leads to distortion of markets. You need structural reforms, electricity, water, and state-owned enterprises. You have to restructure the banking sector, and you have to put in place an anti-corruption program. And you need to reform or put in place a social protection program. I'll discuss these in a little bit more detail in a minute. If you don't reform, which seems to be the case at the moment, then we're heading towards hyperinflation. Now, some people have said that Lebanon is already in hyperinflation. No, that is not the case. The classical definition of hyperinflation, the one we economists use, is that of Phil Kagan, who studied the German hyperinflation, the mother of all hyperinflations, where the inflation rate would increase by about 50% per month, 50% per month. That is the definition of hyperinflation. We're not there yet, but we might very well get there yet, along with continued depreciation of the pound. All of this, because of there's no confidence in the banking financial system, means that you end up in a cash economy, and in some cases, a barter economy. Your banking system becomes a purely zombie banking system, and you're going to go into long-term economic depression. By long-term, we're saying 15, 20 years and potentially longer, with a loss of human capital. The loss of human capital is critical simply because of the following fact. Countries that destroyed their human capital, and we've seen countries in wars such as Cambodia, where the Khmer Rouge killed some 3 million of their own citizens, was never able to recover because they killed the professionals and the people who had a lot of human capital. It's never been able to recover. Salvador is another case. There you can multiply the cases in Africa and elsewhere. So that is the biggest danger of all. And of course, you're likely to have a collapse of law and order, not to mention potential civil war. And if you don't have reforms, you're going to go into poverty and famine, and you won't get any external financing. Let me spend a few minutes on the types of reforms that are required, and then we can discuss these in details. The first one that needs to happen is to set the stage through what I call appropriate policy sequencing, i.e. you have a fiscal adjustment and you have fiscal reforms before you undertake exchange rate reform and monetary reform, because that has to anchor the system. You have to move towards flexible exchange rates and a system of inflation targeting. So I'm calling for an end to the exchange rate peg and moving as quickly as possible to flexible exchange rates. That was the history of Lebanon before it was pegged in the mid-1990s. Second thing, critical one, is you have to stop all BDL financing of the public sector and all quasi-fiscal operations, all subsidies, financing, and the rest, including all sorts of little schemes such as for housing, SMEs, etc. That is not the job of a central bank. You need a politically independent banking regulator and central bank, which is not the case at the moment. Given where we are now, we're going to have a new currency. That should be part of the reforms. Again, in order to have a new lira, you're going to have to undertake the other reforms. So it has to be a complete, holistic package. Banking secrecy has to be abolished. Banking secrecy is really the cover for a lot of corruption, waste, bribery, and the rest. We cannot continue with the current system of having a banking secrecy law. You also have to have deep reforms at the level of the central bank, limit the term of the governor and the vice governors to 4 years, only once renewable, and there should be no accumulation of functions. At the moment, Riyad Salami is not only the governor of the central bank, he's also the head of the Capital Market Authority, and he also is the head of the Special Investigations Commission, which investigates money laundering and other financial wrongdoing. That is unacceptable. No country in the world has that. You always have a separation between the Capital Market Authority and the banking and financial system. And you want an independent Capital Market Authority, you want an independent Banking Control Commission. You don't want to have them both financed by the central bank and sitting in the central bank. They cannot achieve their purpose by doing so. And of course, you're going to have much more transparency, disclosure. The central bank has not published accounts in decades, so that has to change. So you have to have audited and published accounts. You need that for transparency and disclosure, but above all for accountability. So I could summarize all those through a new money and credit code. Second bit in terms of reforms is the fiscal reform, public sector restructuring, and structural reforms. One of the first ones, of course, is to address tax evasion. Tax evasion is rife, of course, in Lebanon. The state collects maybe 30% at best of collectible taxes. And of course, there's a large underground economy, estimated at maybe 30 to 40%, of people who don't pay taxes. That has to change. And again, this tax evasion is aided and abetted by banking secrecy. That's why that has to end. If you want to have a credible adjustment, my recommendation would be to have a fiscal rule. The fiscal rule would normally say, would enshrine this and practically in the constitution of saying maximum budget deficit should be X%, maybe 2%, 3%. You can have that for total debt. There are many ways to impose a fiscal rule, but the important thing is you stick to it. Third and very important bit is, of course, structural reforms. Everybody discusses EDL, but that's only really part of it. You really should be looking at state-owned enterprises, including water, the telecom sector. The telecom sector used to be a big revenue earner for government. It no longer is. Because of corruption, because of nepotism, it now employs a large number of people who are totally unnecessary. And reviewing the whole state-owned and government-related enterprises should be a major plank of the reform agenda. My recommendation here is that we should set up a national wealth fund. This would be similar to what, say, Singapore has through Temasek. Temasek manages all the state-owned enterprises, government-related enterprises of Singapore. On average, it earns on those assets something like 12 to 13% per annum. They make them perform like as if they were in the private sector, like private sector managed, and they perform. So that national wealth fund would also incorporate any future oil and gas revenues. I'm against any privatization. Currently, of course, I'm sure you're hearing that from the banks and some politicians that, okay, since the banks lent the central bank and the central bank says it lent to government, that they should take over state assets. That, of course, is not a solution. All it would mean is that you would reward the banks and the central bank for the collapse. Instead of having a bail-in, you would have a bailout. So that is not an option. And privatization, therefore, is also not an option until you reform and you impose good governance of the SOEs and GREs. Next bit is to move to digital government. I happen to be, I spend quite a bit of time in Dubai. Much of my work is in Dubai. 90% to 95% of my interaction with government in the UAE and Dubai is now done through my mobile phone. Digital government, interactive. Had we moved to e-government and digital government, we could have stopped a lot of the corruption. Yeah. There's now a new government procurement law which was passed. That needs implementation as quickly as possible. You need to reform the subsidies and move towards smart, targeted cash subsidies. Pension system reform and social protection reform is a #1 priority. The social security system, in effect, is bankrupt. Why? Because nearly all the social security funds were put into government treasury bills. So inflation has wiped out all the value. And of course, we've got an aging population. So the contributions to social security over time have been declining. So actuarially, from an actuarial point of view, it is a bankrupt system. So it needs complete overhaul and reform. And as a result of that, we also need to rethink the size of government, including the size of our armed services. To give you a number, the size of the Lebanese army today is around 80,000. I don't know how many people know this, but I checked, and the size of the army, of the armed services in the UK, Great Britain, including what they have outside, is 77,000. So please register that. And that does not include, of course, the other internal security forces and all the rest. Ghost workers in government and the public sector are a massive problem. I estimate that 20 to 25% of those workers don't exist. They're either dead or still on the payroll, or they left the country but continue, migrated, gone somewhere else, but they continue to collect a salary, or they're still in the country but don't go to work but still collect a salary, or have somebody else tick in and still collect a salary. And the other major thing that, given the levels of corruption that we know, is to put in place a stolen asset recovery initiative. This has been successful in a number of countries, and we can discuss that, but that has to be put in place as part of an anti-corruption drive. So those are two main sets of reforms. I mean, as I said, I focus mainly on the economic and financial reforms more than anything else, but happy to discuss other issues. So let me end with a short summary, basically, of some major points. Lebanon, our country, is paying the price of unsustainable fixed exchange rate, fiscal and debt policies. So we have identified the problem. We know what it is about. Of course, underlying that is corruption, nepotism, and a highly corrupt political system. Second point is that the deep depression that we are now living, unprecedented practically in history, and financial meltdown, were avoidable. What's happening now is deliberate policies by politicians, central bank, and government to impose real deflation through an inflation tax and increased lirification. So we're living the bursting of the biggest Ponzi scheme in history, largest deposit haircut in history, and the largest transfer of wealth that I know of that has happened in any country, apart from cases of war or violence or natural calamities, which is not the case. Now, the reforms I mentioned come at a cost. Lebanon cannot finance much of the restructuring that I mentioned, in particular, the restructuring of the banking sector. So if I just go back that for a second, if you look at what's required in terms of restoring trust in terms of the banking sector, you're going to have to restructure the whole banking sector. That means mergers and acquisitions and a reduction in total number. You've got to restructure the BDL and its debt, and you have to restructure the public debt as a whole. Now, in order to do so, you're going to need a financial rescue package. from the rest of the world. I estimate that, and it's been growing. I estimate that today at about 75 billion. You'll need some 20 billion to 30 billion between for the banks and the central bank, BDL. Now for the banks, let me explain where that number comes from. The 20 billion would result from a bail-in of the shareholders of the banks. They have assets abroad, they have assets in Lebanon. The shareholders are responsible for their banks, so they should be tapped first. There should be a bail-in of them. They earned extraordinary profits and because of interest and the bailout by the central bank. So that 20 billion is not internationally financed. It's a package. 20 billion has to come from the shareholders and sale of assets, both here and abroad. We'll need at least 15 billion for infrastructure and fiscal transition to put in place a fiscal reform plan will probably require some 10 billion interim financing. Some 5 billion needs to come for balance of payment support. This can be done through agreements with other central banks, that would allow us to have an exchange between the banks financing for imports, basically. And finally, you're going to need at least some 15 billion for the private sector. This is critical because the private sector is where the jobs will have to be created, right? Not in government. You're going to have to reduce the size of government. Now, all of that has to come through an agreement with the IMF. And as I note, this is imperative. But of course, as we very well know, on the IMF and other international organizations, World Bank and UN and others, all have said that this is conditional on undertaking a comprehensive set of deep governance, economic, monetary, fiscal, and structural reforms. So we know the message. The main question is, are our politicians willing to undertake those reforms, or will they just continue deepening the crisis and letting Lebanon become a failed state? Unfortunately, so far, that seems to be the direction in which we're heading. Let me just end with this picture. This is a sculpture by the Italian sculptor Bruno Catalano. It's called The Immigrant's Void. I thought it would be very appropriate to end on this, even though it's unfortunately not a positive note. But it illustrates, I think, the depth of how many immigrants feel that they've lost their home country. And in many cases, families have been fragmented. And when you destroy families, you destroy the major institution. It is what keeps countries together. And that is being broken right now. So thank you. Let me stop there, and I might have taken a bit too long, but open to questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saidi, for this very insightful presentation. And I think the last slide, unfortunately, illustrates a lot of what many are going through at this time. So the floor is open to questions. If you have any, so there's already one question on the chat box by Dr. Maroon Mubarak. He's asking if you are in favor of increasing the dollar value for custom duties from the official rate. What would, in your opinion, be a fair rate?
Yeah, I mean, this is a straightforward answer and a very quick one. Yes, immediately. You have to increase that. You'd have to find something that's close to the market rate. Obviously, the market, the foreign exchange market is a highly illiquid market. So the rates that are discussed in lira.org and others that I illustrated in my chart are not necessarily representative, but I would choose something maybe a little bit below that. And I won't give a number, but I think it would be a multiple of a large multiple of the current 1505. Remember that this is a major source of income for government, of revenue for government. And the fact that you keep the rate so low is a continuing invitation to continuing subsidy to imports. So yes, immediate reform. I'm not quite sure why the government has not done so already. الدولار الجمركي بدعة، هذه بدعة لبنانية ما إلى أي أساس.
Thank you very much.
Eventually, if inflation continues, you're going to have an inflation adjustment of the tax system, right? I mean, taxes will have to rise along with inflation. And of course, that means higher cost of living, higher cost in terms of anything that includes taxes. But that is a bitter pill, but it is better than hyperinflation.
Thank you. May I suggest, Dr. Saidi, that you stop sharing and maybe the camera will turn on, I hope, in this eventuality.
Great. Okay, now I can see everybody. Great. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe you can turn on the camera. Maybe now it would function, I hope.
Isn't my camera turned on?
No, it's at least I don't see.
Whoops. Okay.
Still not working. I guess technical difficulties. Okay, so I have another question here on the box. Do you see any role for a social and economic council, at least as part of the consultation for the urgently needed reforms? And also, do you favor cash transfers to the most vulnerable? So, in fact, two questions in one.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
All right.
So should I repeat the question?
No, I have the question. So as you know, there's been a lot of discussion about of having cash transfers. Yes, I am in favor of cash transfers, and that should have been done immediately, as quickly as possible. There have been many delays. Part of the delays is simply in order to define the list of potential recipients of the aid. Yeah. Politicians in parliament and in government have their own favorite list of people they want to help. We have to avoid that at all costs, particularly as we're coming into an election year. We know what their intention is. Their intention is to use whatever money from the World Bank and humanitarian organizations and all the rest to have a بطاقة انتخابية منا بطاقة تمويل للفقراء. So the World Bank knows how to do it. They have a list that they had prepared some 2.5, 3 years ago, if I recall well. That list needs to be updated of households. Unfortunately, the number of households has gone up, the number of people that we want to help and the number of households. Now, we know how to do this. I think this is extremely important. Technically, we know how to do this. The World Bank, UN have done so for refugees, Syrian refugees, for example, in Jordan and even in Lebanon. I've seen it operate, for example, in Jordan. where biometrics are used. You can even use a smartphone. You can even use a smartphone to deliver the aid. However, this is only a short-term measure. This is only a short-term measure. As I mentioned, the priority is to look at the social protection system. You need a reform of social protection in Lebanon. What I mean by that is that we are one of the countries that doesn't have, for example, unemployment insurance. If you look at social security, it needs to be reformed entirely. Many people came into social security and are abusing the system. Again, the politicians are responsible for destroying the social security system. So it's not just the cash transfer and just to help the very poor. You need a comprehensive reform, a comprehensive reform of the social protection system. And that means really reworking and reforming the social security system and protecting it.
Thank you. Another question is the following. So with partially using our gold reserves, can that be part of a short-term maybe adjustment, or you think that would be a bad idea?
I think the politicians would love to be able to get hold of 15 to 16 billion to spend, as would the central bank. But I'm not in favor of using the gold reserves until you have fundamental fiscal and monetary reform. Yeah. If you don't have that, the gold will just be thrown away, just like they've thrown away and abused all the reserves. So what you should do is you say, I've got the gold reserves. They're part of an overall package that I would negotiate with the IMF. I would use that as part of the collateral that we can use, but I would never allow the politicians to get their hands on it. They would love to do that. They would love to say, you know, this is a dramatic situation. This is an emergency. This is what the gold was for. Yeah. So let's use it now, since Lebanon is in a sorry state. Yalla, let's use it. This is what they would love to do. And particularly in an election year, we have to resist that to the utmost.
Thank you. A question about blockchain technology. So I think this ties to an idea that our central bank circulated at some point about a digital currency and you know whether that could help in the current circumstances.
Yeah. Okay. Two things. First, I'm not against the idea of central bank digital currencies. They're certainly better than Bitcoin, right? Okay. Bitcoin is a bubble thing. So central bank digital currencies are, yes, they can be a useful part of a system for increased financial inclusion for maybe people who don't have access to banks and to the financial system. So using a central bank digital currency can be useful. Now, under current circumstances, again, this is an idea, this is pie in the sky. This is throwing it as though this will help solve our monetary and exchange rate problems. This is absolute nonsense. Central bank digital currency would not have any more credibility than the current Lebanese pound, right? And probably would be subject to a great deal of speculation, yeah, a great deal of opaqueness, throwing around things like distributed ledger technology and blockchain is throwing dust in your eyes to make it sound scientifically valid. This would just be another instrument to inflate away the rest of your deposits and the rest of your money. So I would be totally against it. Let's focus on true reform, fiscal and monetary policy reform. Let's not try to divert attention through things like central bank digital currency.
Great, thank you. Question about the maybe fair value of the pound. So what do you think would be the real value of $1 in Lebanese liras in case reforms are implemented?
By the way, can you see me now? No?
No, we still can't, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Maybe Hani can help. Hani, are you still
Not quite
around?
sure. Okay, never mind. So sorry. Hold on, let me just try one more time. There we go. Can you see me?
Okay. Yeah, we can see you. Perfect.
Akhiran. Right. Okay. So sorry, what was the question?
So the fair value of the pound. So in a positive scenario. So in case reforms are implemented, what do you think is the real value or fair value of the pound?
Look, any currency at the end of the day is subject to economic developments, their current situation and the future prospects. It is tied to economic policies, to monetary and fiscal policies. And until you have clarity about monetary, economic, and fiscal policies, there is no anchor to the Lebanese pound. Yeah, we have to be very clear about that. That's exactly what we've lived over the past 2 years. Right. So if I can imagine, so let me put it the following way. If you go back to the IMF Article 4, the various Article 4 reports of the IMF, and the Lazar brothers study that was done for the Diab government and which was the basis of initial negotiations with the IMF, it was envisaged that there would be a gradual depreciation of the Lebanese pound from 1,500 to about 5,000, 6,000 over the space of 3 years. Yeah. That was assuming that there would be a steady adjustment along with fiscal reforms, monetary policy reform, etc. Now that is beyond us. I don't think we can go back to that. Why? Because the costs have accumulated. Some of the adjustment that would have taken place happened already over the past 2 years, but in brutal fashion. So for example, now you've reduced the real value of the debt, okay, substantially because of inflation. Although the value and the cost of your external foreign currency debt has gone up commensurately, okay. So if you're trying to think of what an anchor would be, I think it would depend on whether you have a financial package with the IMF and what the size of that package is. I mentioned the number of about 75 billion overall financial package. I think Lebanon can live with anything between 50 to 75 billion. If you can, of course, that would not come in 1 year. This would be coming in over several years. It would be a fiscal program over 3 to 5 years, right? So it's not like as if somebody's going to open the tap and suddenly we get 50 to 75 billion. No. But assuming you have a program with the IMF, assuming that you undertake adjustments, I could easily see that there would be a rapid appreciation of the Lebanese pound, particularly if you start restoring confidence in the banking system, i.e. you have a restructuring of the banking system, that would attract remittances to come back through and flow through the banking system, and beginning of capital inflows, rebuilding of your infrastructure, and the rest. Actual value, I would hesitate. I'm not going to go on the record to say that there's a particular value we can reach. I would assume there would be a very rapid appreciation of the Lebanese pound if you have an agreement with the IMF and the other conditions which I mentioned.
Thank you. One more question about the size of the package. So, how realistic would it be to have a package of $75 billion, as you stated in the presentation? So, I'm assuming, so Ingrid is asking this, but I'm assuming this is a multi-year.
It is a
projection.
multi-year. It is multi-year. So, for example, I mentioned that there would be balance of payment support of, say, some 5 billion, which you need for imports and financing trade. Those can come through swap agreements, yeah, with other central banks. Okay, typically that's what you would do. You have a swap agreement with central banks that would want to help Lebanon, say maybe some of the GCC countries, some of the European countries, or other. So it does not necessarily mean that it's a loan. It's a swap. Yeah, this is important. So how likely is it? The question is more political rather than it is economic. Lebanon has to restore its ties to the Gulf countries, who would be the major countries that would help finance this rescue package, along with the EU, maybe China, a couple of other countries, maybe the United States. So yes, I think it is realistic, but it hinges, of course, on the reforms that we discussed. Again, absent reforms, Lebanon is not going to get any financial assistance, any financial help.
Thank you.
And just to explain, usually when you've got an IMF program that you've agreed with the fund, everybody would participate in that program that the fund would help design, along with Lebanon. And then the funding would come in, but it would be conditional. It is conditional on your undertaking the reforms, whether it's fiscal reforms, monetary policy reform, or other. I know the number looks large, but I still think it's feasible, because part of it, of course, would come from the private sector. A good part of it, for example, in terms of restructuring the banking sector, would have to be private sector led, right? A lot of reforms can be financed by the private sector.
Thank you. So we have a number of interesting questions. I'll start with one that's by Dr. Azam. So why did you not factor future oil and gas revenues into the projections or macroeconomic framework?
Many reasons. Let me give you the technical reasons for that, and what we know from the experience of other countries. Usually, it takes 2 to 3 years between the drilling and making sure that you actually have something which is commercially viable. Yeah. So on average, only one drilled well in 5, that is 15 to 20%, actually is successful, right? Okay, that's to begin with. And usually you start your drilling in various places, and that would take 2 to 3 years. Then, assuming that you find potentially recoverable reserves, you're talking about 3 to 4 years of investment in order to have the platforms. We're talking offshore, right? This is not onshore, this is offshore. So simply putting that in place would take another 3 to 4 years minimum. So what you're talking about is that you would only really start getting revenue in years, at best, between years 8 to 10, moving forward. There's also another problem in the case of Lebanon, namely, how do you export it? How do you export it? There's discussions, as you know, ongoing right now of various pipelines, okay? Linking Egypt, Cyprus, and others to be able to export to Europe. Lebanon has refused to participate in those discussions. So you might end up having oil out there, but unable to export it. And if you're not clear how you're going to be able to export it, no company is going to be willing to make the investment and to drill. Not Total, not anybody else. All right? Why would I drill if I don't know how I'm going to be exporting it? So there's a great deal of uncertainty there. There's also a great deal of uncertainty about the price. We're talking maybe 8 to 10 years from now. Lots of discovery, lots of oil and gas across the world. We've been late already. We've already lost about 10 years. By the time our oil comes to the market, I don't know what the price would be. The world is shifting away from oil and gas and fossil fuels towards renewable energy. So for all those reasons, I didn't include that in the number. Of course, if I were a politician, I would sell you samak bil bahr. I would tell you, yes, of course, we're going to have this oil and gas. We're going to be a petro state. So let's continue spending now because it's going to be coming in the future. This, of course, is political nonsense. This is not reality.
Okay, thank you. So one question about the digital government and how likely do you think this is going to be happening soon?
Yeah. Look, this is unfortunately something I know rather well. I say unfortunately because at the time I was a minister of economy. This was in the year 2000, not 2010, 2000. We prepared a law on e-government. We prepared a draft law for e-government and e-signatures, right? To allow us the use of electronic signatures in the banking system and the economy as a total. It stayed in Parliament for some 17 years, right? 18 years, and we're still not there. And we had a strategy for e-government. Nobody wanted to go ahead. Everybody said, oh, that's a great idea. But then when I asked for funding, nobody wanted to give any funding. The fundamental reason is that they don't want e-government because it is a tool, it is an anti-corruption tool, right? Like good procurement, like the procurement law that was passed. The best way to prevent corruption, bribery, and all the rest is for e-government and or digital government, preferably. How likely is it? If you have the procurement law, which has already been passed Parliament, and you want to move to application, you could do it gradually. Start taking sectors of government spending and turn them digital, turn them e-government. Then you can start getting places. I'm not optimistic at the moment, is the short answer.
Perfect, thank you. So do you have time for another? We have like 3 or 4 questions. Can you take them?
A pleasure.
Okay. Thank you. So the first is about, can we separate the economic from the political? So can we separate the economic crisis from the political setup, maybe, and institutions that are weak in this country?
The short answer is, of course, no. If you notice the list of reforms that I mentioned, say the fiscal rule, what's the idea behind the fiscal rule? The idea behind the fiscal rule is that you constrain the politicians. In other words, you say, whatever happens, I will not allow, for example, the budget deficit to exceed 2 to 3% of GDP, whatever happens. Yeah? You cut down spending, you increase taxes, etc. We cannot go beyond 2 to 3%. That imposes a rule. Yeah, it constrains it. You can have one also in terms of debt to GDP, etc. For example, the European Union has a rule which is 3% deficits maximum. You should not go beyond 70% of GDP in terms of debt and the like. So that would be one. The same is the case in terms of the monetary reforms that I mentioned. Having an independent central bank, an independent banking regulator, an independent capital market authority, an independent special investigations committee. All of those mean that you cut the hands of the politicians from intervening. If you do that, and you also have an anti-corruption drive, then you can start divorcing politics from the economy. Yeah. This is not the case right now, as we well know, simply because the politicians don't find it in their own interest to reform. They own the state. Let's remember. I mean, the militias, the parties, etc., actually own much of the state. They're in the government. They're in the various councils, across all the councils that we know. Majlis al-Amar, we all know that. You have to cut their hand out of it. I mean, that's why I was suggesting that we have a national wealth fund. The national wealth fund would be effectively like a private equity company. It would manage and control Électricité du Liban, telecoms, and all the rest, and would not allow the politicians to interfere. Yeah, you can't hire people and all the rest. Question, are they likely to pass a law whereby they would transfer those assets into a national wealth fund for them to be well managed and well governed? I doubt it. But that is what we have to hope for. I mean, this is why hopefully you'll have elections with change. But I think there's something extremely important that I want to mention. What I found shocking above all over the past 2 years is that for us as economists, and maybe many of the people listening in are economists or social scientists or political scientists or whatever, the level of economic and political discourse, public discourse, was terrible. For example, Parliament has not met a single time to discuss the multiple crises that Lebanon has gone through. This is historically unprecedented crises, let alone the explosion in the port. We're talking about economic and financial and banking and currency meltdown. Parliament has not met a single time to discuss that. Our intellectuals, such as they are, if I look at what came out in the media, public media, on the television, etc., does not discuss the crisis. What it discusses is how good the politicians are. And the politicians get on to the various shows and blame each other, right? It's your fault and that guy's fault. And nobody actually discusses what happened. True, we produce academic papers. We've done a lot of work through various Hirak movements and all the rest. I've been involved with many of them. We've produced stuff, recommendations and all the rest. We've met with the politicians, we've met with government ministers and all the rest. But the public discourse is what I'm talking about. The public discourse is not there. People, when they go down in the street, seem to be going down for very different reasons. Whereas the economic and financial arguments should be the main thing. You've destroyed their livelihood. You've led people into poverty. And yet there has been no accountability for that. And nobody has pointed to the reasons for that. And I think from that point of view, we are a little bit to blame. I think we need to be much more forceful and open. Yeah, whether it's a level of universities, think tanks, or whatever. Public discourse has got to be much better informed.
Thank you. Last two questions. So The first is, do you think there will be a haircut on deposits?
It's already happened.
Okay.
It's already happened. I mean, this is what they're hoping for. This is what the central bank is hoping for.
And
I mean,
this,
when they block access to your accounts and they inflate and they have lirification, they're gradually transforming your dollars, local dollars, into Lebanese pounds, and therefore it's a tax, it's a haircut. And the banks, of course, are happy with that because it reduces their liabilities, right? And so here, government with the central bank are allies, along with some politicians who manage to get their money out, right, for a massive haircut. So instead of adjustment, they'll say, well, the problem has gone away because the liabilities are no longer there. So in effect today, you've got an 80% haircut, right? What you need to do is to demonstrate, revolt, attack the politicians. You've got to vote. You've got to hope for change to prevent that massive haircut, which is precisely what they are planning. When I said that much of it, when I said the crisis was avoidable, I meant that the crisis was avoidable. What's been happening in the past 2 years is deliberate.
thank you. The final question is about the public-private partnership. So I think the PPP model.
Yes.
So do you think this is, I mean, viable in Lebanon, and do you see prospects for a private sector-led reform?
Yes, I think it is viable. There is a framework for PPP in Lebanon. It's being prepared with the World Bank IFC. So yes, I think there is potential, particularly in a number of sectors, oil, water, electricity, telecoms, and other. However, if you're going to be doing that, you need to ensure, number one, that there is sufficient competition, right? If the private sector is going to go into power production and water production, etc., and telecoms and all the rest, you have to ensure sufficient competition. And you want the sectors to be well regulated. You take the telecom sector or you take the electricity sector, the reform laws said there should be an independent regulator. Of course, the ministers involved never wanted that because they want to keep their hand on the kitty. They want to keep their hand on where the spending goes in those sectors, right? So it never happened. So yes, for PPP, but it has to be well regulated, well governed, with accountability, with reporting on what happens. Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. So with that,
I mean, I know there are plenty of other questions. I mean, we can go on, but
I don't want to tax your time, though. I know you have a very busy schedule. So thank you so very much for being with
Thank
us.
you.
I mean, as usual, it's been always extremely informative to hear you.
Thank you.
And we truly appreciate your presence today with us.
Shukran.
And
Thank
we
you.
hope to host you in person, as Dean Sidani mentioned.
With pleasure, with pleasure. May I just say that at the end, it's a pleasure to be virtually with you at AUB. But I can also only end by encouraging you. Remember that picture of that migrant, right, which I left you with, right? It's a picture where the migrant is void, right? They emptied us when these people are leaving the country. They've been emptied. Their soul has been stolen away. I think it is part of our responsibility as intellectuals, as academics, as researchers, as people working, particularly with their mind, to hold policymakers accountable. Yeah, hold policymakers accountable. If there's no accountability, there won't be any reform. You can have an IMF program, but if you don't hold the people accountable for where we got here, they will do it again. They will do it again. They will do whatever is necessary right now. They will do whatever is necessary to appear to have reformed, to get as much money in, and then they will do it again. That's what I've seen in other countries. I've done a lot of work in Latin America and Central America on reforms and countries that wanted to reform. And that's exactly what they did. Argentina, Venezuela. Argentina has, I can't remember how many IMF programs they've had. They've had 5, 6, right? They got the money and then they continue.
Unfortunately.
We have to stop them.
Yeah.
So let's hope that elections will allow us to get them out.
Indeed, we do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, it's been an absolute delight to have you with us.
Thank you.
Dean Sidani, do you want to close this?
I just want to say thank you very much. It has been extremely insightful.
Thank you.
Some colleagues are writing insightful and sad. I don't think it was sad. It was realistic with lots of hope and lots of good vibes eventually. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to meet again. Thank you.
Inshallah.
I want
Take
to
care.
thank everybody who attended. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.